You can read the detailed biographical information about Dr. Wegner in your program. I'll just highlight two things. First, the title Distinguished Professor illustrates the high regard the seminary has for his scholarship, his teaching ability, and his overall service as a faculty member. In our school's history, there have been 2 faculty members bear this title, and so it speaks to how rare of an honor it truly is. The second thing I would say about him is not only is Paul a gifted academic in terms of writing and speaking, an outstanding professor in the classroom, but he is also a winsome and committed Christian, a person who models and demonstrates for us on a daily basis what it means to walk with humility and integrity in his academic pursuits. And so I present to you today Dr. Paul Wegner.
I've always thought Dr. Orge had the hardest job. How do you think of that many nice things to say about me?
I'm up all night.
Yeah. All right, for you who are going to fall asleep right after I get started, the answer to the question, when it comes up there, can you click through there a minute? Yeah. Can you see the Isaiah seal? That one has just been found, and I thought you guys should get to see it since we're talking about Isaiah, so I thought that would help. All right. I was going to tell you, so for you who are going to fall asleep right after I get started, the answer is there's only one, but the important part is how come, all right? So that's what hopefully will keep you awake. Yeah. And also, if you're reading the paper, there are parts that I've had to cut out, so just follow me along and try to catch up where I am. All right. There's no doubt that Isaiah 7:14 and its reuse in Matthew 1:23 is one of the most difficult problems for modern biblical scholars. For me, this problem started about over 30 years ago when I was a seminary student. I went to TEDS, and at that point, they thought that whatever the New Testament said about this passage must be what it meant. So I thought that must refer to Jesus then. Then I went to University of London, and they thought that whatever the Old Testament said about it must be correct. Thus, they thought it referred to a child that was born in Ahaz's day. But I had the funny idea that both the Old Testament and the New Testament should be right, but I had no idea how it worked out. For centuries, attempts have been made to try to provide clear rationale as to how Matthew can pick up this passage from Isaiah, which appears to have its own historical context, and apply it to Jesus. The idea of this passage refers to Christ goes back at least as far as Tertullian, an early North African church father, who stated the following: "But we need to show why the Son of God had to be born of a virgin. It is to be expected that the one who is going to inaugurate a new birth had to be born in a new way. And Isaiah had foretold that the Lord would give a sign of this. This is a sign. Look, a virgin shall conceive in her womb and bear a son. Accordingly, a virgin did conceive and bore Emmanuel, God with us." However, it's very difficult to see how Matthew could apply this verse to Jesus given its present context in the book of Isaiah. New Testament scholars understandably emphasize the New Testament use of the Isaianic passage and its fulfillment in Jesus. Dr. Kaiser uses, because of his emphasis on single intent of the author, seems to demand such a reading. However, the more one examines Isaiah 7 in its near context, the more problems arise. Klein, Blomberg, and Hubbard nicely summarize the problem. Though Kaiser has done an admirable job of defending his case in several problematic passages, we doubt he has succeeded in every instance, or that it is possible to demonstrate that the Old Testament writers did in fact intend all the meaning that New Testament writers later found. We suggest there are instances where New Testament writers found meaning in the Old Testament text that the Old Testament author did not intend. If they are correct, then at least 3 questions need to be addressed. 1, how is Isaiah 7, 14 through 17 related to its context? 2, how is Isaiah 7, 14 through 17 fulfilled in Christ? And 3, is there more than one virgin birth? The first question, how is Isaiah 7:14 related to its context? Isaiah 7 is part of the so-called Isaianic memoir in chapter 6:1 through 9:7, and describes events surrounding the Syro-Ephraimite War in 734 through 732. However, in the mid-century, 8th century BC, Assyria was beginning to expand his empire, and part of its goal was to reach Lebanon. Syria recognized Assyria's intent and realized that Assyria would view them as a major obstacle to their goal. Syria and Israel, at this point called Ephraim, therefore formed an alliance to repel the Assyrians. This new alliance hoped to gain further strength from the surrounding nations. But Ahaz, the king of Judah, was unwilling to join forces with them. This placed Syria and Israel in a precarious position. Assyria forces would be coming from the east and the north, while Judah, a possible enemy, lay to the south. Thus, the coalition of Syria and Israel were getting ready to descend upon Jerusalem to neutralize this possible threat to their plan. This is the historical context of Isaiah 7. The first two verses of the chapter provide the setting of the oracle by summarizing the events that led up to the Syro-Ephraimite War. The readers were made aware that the coalition's hopes would not be realized. Ahaz and his people were not privy to this information, and they were terrified of the prospect of an attack on Jerusalem by a much stronger coalition of Syria and Israel, in verse 2. God sends Isaiah and his son Shear-Yashub to Ahaz to encourage him to trust in Yahweh as their protector and not to fear the coalition. But Ahaz demonstrated an amazing lack of faith in Yahweh. God then provides 4 additional means of encouragement for Ahaz to trust him. Nevertheless, Ahaz ultimately calls on Assyria for help against the coalition instead. The 4 means of encouragement are, number 1, God's assurance that the coalition would not harm them, verses 3 through 7. God sends Isaiah and his son to Ahaz at the conduit of the upper pool, most likely while Ahaz was monitoring his water supply to make sure Judah had enough water for a sustained attack from Syria and Israel. But God's message to Ahaz is, do not fear these 2 countries. Their power is nearly depleted, and they're pictured as smoldering coals of a burned-out fire. Their elaborate plan of capturing Jerusalem, tearing down its walls, setting up the puppet king Tabeel, will not come to pass. Number 2, the circumlocution in verses 8 and 9. This interesting figure of speech is intended to encourage Ahaz to take his eyes off the 2 powerful countries sitting on his northern border and realize instead that they are controlled by 2 mere men. God certainly can take care of them. Once he has done that, the 2 countries will no longer be a threat. The structure is as follows. The head of Aram is Damascus. The head of Damascus is Rezin. Then for Israel, the head of Israel is Samaria. The head of Samaria is Pekah. Why be afraid of 2 mere men? This section ends with an interesting play on the Hebrew word aman. In the Hiphil form, it carries a nuance to believe. But in the Niphal form, it means to stand or be established. Therefore, it should probably be translated something like, if you will not believe, you surely shall not be established, in verse 9. Number 3, an offer of a sign, verses 10 through 13. Again, God sends Isaiah to Ahaz. The timing of these 2 messages is uncertain, but he sends him to offer Ahaz a chance of requesting a sign from God. The sign is only limited by Ahaz's imagination, and a merism is used to indicate its breadth, as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven, and everything in between. Paul Kruger notes that the essence of a sign is that it's a means of transmitting information. The contents of the information is determined by the context in which it is used. The sun, moon, and stars are used as signs to signal the change of times and seasons in Genesis 1:14. The rainbow is a sign signifying to mankind that God will not flood the earth again in Genesis 9:12 and 13 and verse 17. Most of the 80 occurrences of the word sign signify some kind of miraculous event. But it can also refer to a common everyday occurrence that has significance because of what it means, foretells, or predicts. In Isaiah 7:12, the sign could be anything, but the emphasis would clearly be on the miraculous, since it is intended to convince Ahaz of God's protection. Ahaz feigns trust by stating that he does not need a sign to believe in Yahweh, and that accepting God's sign would be a test to him. God, through Isaiah, quickly rebuffs this, and in Isaiah verse 13, suggests that Ahaz's indecision has been frustrating to his people. But the lack of faith will prove to also be trying to God's patience as well. A subtle change takes place in this verse. For the sign is offered from the Lord your God, but Ahaz's lack of faith demonstrates that Yahweh is not his God. Isaiah therefore asks at the end of the verse, if Ahaz will also try the patience of God, of Isaiah's God, implying that Yahweh is no longer Ahaz's God. Number 4, the sign from God, verses 14 through 17. Ahaz rejected the divine sign, and yet God still provides one. However, this one might not be to his liking, since it's God's choice, not his. Nevertheless, God's sign is very gracious. The sign contains both positive elements in verses 14 through 16 and also negative elements in verse 17. The first part of the sign in verse 14 has 3 parts. A young woman is pregnant. She will have a son. She will call his name Emmanuel, which most likely is understood, God is with us. Already, Ahaz has some reason to be encouraged. For children will continue to be born, at least one, and the mother must have some reason to express this great, significant trust in God. The identity of the Alma in verse 14 is highly uncertain. This is not the place for a thorough discussion of the meanings, although I'd like to do that for you, but we won't do it. For the two Hebrew words, Alma, which usually means a young woman, and batula, which usually means a virgin. But a summary of the relevant evidence is crucial for a proper understanding of Isaiah 7:14. It is difficult to differentiate all the specific nuances of Hebrew words, alma and batula, since little additional information is given in the passage in which they occur. There may be some significant overlaps in meanings between these two words also. Cognate languages in Hebrew and the Hebrew masculine forms suggest that alma is a young girl. And at least the Ugaritic cognate, golma, or golmot, should not be translated as virgin. One of the 7 occurrences of the word alma in the Old Testament and the 5 abstract plural forms alumim, the clearest passages describing the characteristics of an alma are Genesis 24:43, Isaiah 7:14, and Song of Solomon 6:8. In Genesis 24, Rebekah is depicted as young, a na'ara, in verse 16, which means girl. She's unmarried in verses 28 through 36 through 51, of marriageable age, or this context wouldn't make any sense, and a virgin in verse 16. And then the phrase added to that is, and a man had not known her. One very telling incident in this passage is that the first time the servant prays to God on how to determine the right girl, he says, now may it be that the girl, Na'ara, to whom I say, and then goes on, but when he retells the story to Rebekah's family, he uses the word Alma in its place, therefore meaning that the words have at least are somewhat interchangeably. It can be used interchangeably. Later in Isaiah 7:14, it states that the Alma is pregnant. The word hara is most likely a predicate adjective, suggesting that the maiden is already in the state of pregnancy. Thus, it's unlikely that an Alma on its own means Virgo intacta or a virgin. Our final passage, Song of Solomon 6:8, distinguishes 3 categories of women in the king's harem, namely queens, concubines, and maidens. And that last word is our word that we're looking at. John Walton argued that these 3 are distinct and mutually exclusive groups within the king's harem. While Walton may be right about these three categories, there would certainly be considerable overlap between concubines and maidens. The fullest description of a king's harem, at least in the Persian Empire, is Esther 2. Initially, young virgins were in one harem, most likely the harem of the virgins. Then, after spending the night with the king, they went to a harem of the concubines. See verse 14. This second harem was guarded by the king's eunuch to assure no further sexual encounters occurred with these women. These verses depict quite clearly what distinguishes the two groups of women, namely, spending the night with the king, implying a sexual encounter. These girls are called young virgins in Esther 2:2. Youngness, therefore, could have the idea of innocence or inexperience. If this passage can be used to enlighten our passage in Song of Solomon, then Walton may not be entirely correct. For a king can indeed have virgins in his harem, especially if he has multiple harems. Thus, the word alumoth in Song of Solomon 6:8 may fit this group of young women well. For some may be technically virgins, but some may not be. This idea is also suggested by the phrase, and maidens without number. Now, for it's unlikely, though I have to admit it's possible, that the king could have had relations with all of them. Even as we noted above, an alma could be pregnant in Isaiah 7:14. Thus, it appears that the word alma could include both women that are virgins and ones that are not. Thus, just as we found in the other two passages above. Therefore, it's most likely that the word alma emphasizes youngness, but does not necessarily demand that she is a virgin. Walton correctly states the very fact that an alma can be barren in Isaiah 54:4, and I've got the passage up there, suggests that such a description cannot be exclusively applied to someone who has not even had the opportunity to bear women or bear children, like a virgin. We also believe that Walton is correct when he concludes, to say this another way, a woman ceases to be an alma when she becomes a mother, not when she becomes a wife or a sexual partner. That's the word alma. Now we want to look at the word batula. The significance of the Hebrew word batula is even more difficult to determine, though it occurs 14 times in the Old Testament. The Semitic background of the word does not seem to provide a conclusive meaning, but suggests the idea of a young girl. Though not necessarily a virgin, Wenham notes a particularly important piece of evidence in an Aramaic spell of a barren woman or barren wife from Nippur, which states, "A virgin travailing but not bearing." See that she wouldn't have any chance to bear if she was a virgin, suggesting the word does not refer to a virgo intacta. However, a Middle Assyrian law, number A55, dated to the 12th century BC, contains the term batulu, certainly does suggest the idea of a virgin. In the case of a man's daughter, this is what 55A says, in the case of a man's daughter, a virgin, and there's our word, who has been living in her father's house, whose father has not been asked for in marriage, and whose hymen has not been opened since she is not married, and no one has had a claim against her father's house, if a man took the virgin by force and ravished her, either in the midst of the city, or in the open country, or at night in the street, or in a granary, or in a city festival, if he has no wife, the ravisher shall give an extra third of silver to her father as a value of a virgin, and her ravisher shall marry her and not cast her off. While evidence from the Semitic cognates of the word batula does not conclusively point to a virgo intacta, there may have been a shift in meaning in the time of the Old Testament. There are several important biblical passages that must be examined to determine how batula is used in the Old Testament. And we want to take seriously Walton's contention. The word may carry several nuances at once. But first, let's see how various scholars have used this word. Wenham argues that the word batula refers to a girl of marriageable age. Walton, however, argues that in such cases of rape or prostitution, that eliminates the possibility of a girl being considered a batula. Consequently, it is preferable to speak of a girl being reputable. This would assume no wanton behavior. Where Walton strives to make this distinction Based on his understanding of Esther 2:19 and Ezekiel 23, verses 3 through 8, we question whether it fits all the evidence. In Genesis 24:16 and Judges 21:12, the word is clarified by the phrase, "and a man had not known her." Wenham may be correct in stating that if the word batula means virgin, then this explanation would be redundant. However, it's more likely what we call a gloss, explaining the meaning of the word, similar to how the word mabul, which means flood in Hebrew, according to some scholars, is clarified by the following phrase, "waters upon the earth," in Genesis 6:17. Now remember, at that point, they'd never had any rain, so they wouldn't know what a flood was. So it makes sense that it needs to be explained. This suggestion is even more likely if Cyrus Gordon is correct when he states, "There is no word in Near Eastern languages that by itself means virgo intacta." Thus, Hebrew may have invented or modified a meaning for this word. Either way, it seems that batula can indeed refer to a virgin, as the additional phrase, "and no man has known her," indicates, but may not be restricted only to this meaning. Several other passages add the word young to the word batula, suggesting that the idea of youngness is not necessarily inherent in the meaning of that word. A good example would be Abishag, the young girl that was used to keep David warm in his old age, who is said to be a young virgin. So she's got both the words put together, Naara and Batula. In this passage, it would be crucial to make sure that any child born from this situation would indeed be King David's son, which would make that child an heir to the throne. Thus, it's of vital importance that Abishag is what we would call a virgin or a virgo intacta. The abstract plural form of batulim also appears to emphasize the idea of virginity, especially in Deuteronomy 22, verses 14 through 16, where a husband can question the virginity of a wife and the girl's parents must produce evidence of the daughter's virginity. What specifically this garment is not important at this point. However, the punishment seems to be quite severe if Wenham's suggestion is correct, that this girlie is mere pre-adolescence or prenubial. That means just before she's married. Wenham argues that the batulim are blood-stained garments. This interpretation of batulim as blood-stained garments, it fits very well the understanding that she's a girl of marriageable age, since at the onset of menstruation would be the clearest sign that she had attained that age. But the strongest evidence against Wenham's view is in verse 21, which states that if the girl cannot be cleared, she shall be stoned because she has played the harlot in her father's house. The meaning of the Hebrew word to play the harlot is really clear in the Old Testament. It means to commit fornication. This phrase fits the idea of her losing her virginity much better than simply being too young to menstruate. Stoning someone for being too young seems harsh and unlikely. The story of Tamar is another good example in 2 Samuel 13. It's pertinent to our examination because after being raped by Amnon, Tamar rips her robes, and these robes are described as ones that virgin daughters of the king wore in verses 18 and 19. Wenham argues that this was merely a common sign of intense grief, but this does not really account for the detailed description of the purpose for the garment, as being the ones that the virgin daughters of the king wore. The intense grief undoubtedly comes from being raped and her unfitness to wear the robes after she's raped. The evidence from Esther 2:19 and Ezekiel 23, 3 through 8 appears to be Walton's strong major arguments against batula, meaning virgin. In Esther 2, verses 17 through 19, these young women appear to be called virgins even after spending the night with the king. This may be accounted for in two ways. Some of the women in the harem were still virgins in preparation, since it's unlikely that Esther was the very last virgin in that harem to go into the king. And number two, the other possibility is that the author had already referred to this group by that title and chose to retain the same term so the readers would know who he's talking about. In Ezekiel 23 passage, it seems to be speaking about a time before Israel played the harlot in Egypt, when her untouched bosom, it's called virgin bosom, connotes never having been caressed or handled previously. If this is a correct understanding of Ezekiel, then it argues for a time when Israel was pure and indeed in her virginal innocence. While these words certainly overlap in meaning, it's reasonable to argue that there are some significant differences, which can be pictured as follows. You can see on the left, Miriam is called an alma, but the emphasis there is just that she's a young girl. Rachel is called both of them. She's a young woman and she's a virgin. And then I think the ones on the far side, the ones on the far side in Exodus, they actually seem to be more emphasizing the idea that it's technically they're virgins for a reason. If alma emphasizes youngness and batula emphasizes virginity, then there will be occasions when their meanings overlap, as well as instances when they carry nuances distinct from one another. You can have a young virgin, which would be the overlap like Rachel, but then you could have an old virgin that would fit outside of that and it would fit alma, or it'd fit batula, but not alma. If alma is indeed pregnant, as we found in Isaiah 7:14, as suggested by the adjective, then within 9 months she would have a son. And she would call his name Emmanuel, meaning God with us. This name carries a particularly positive meaning considering that the child would be born during a time of war. However, the historical context may provide the reason for such a positive name. The sign appeared to be given when Ahaz is checking his water supply, shortly before the Syro-Ephraimite army arrived outside of Jerusalem. The child would have been born about 734 when the Syro-Ephraimite army had taken off to defend Damascus. So at one point, the people of Jerusalem faced almost certain doom. Yet shortly afterwards, the armies were gone. This would be a convincing evidence that God had indeed delivered them. We believe that the woman had good reasons for calling her child Emmanuel, based on the historical context. The rest of the sign is more fully developed in verses 15 and 16, which are in the form of a chiasm. If we look at the A, you can see, he will eat curds and honey. Then B, at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. B prime, for before the time the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good. A prime, the land of the two kings you dread will be forsaken. The signs directly relate to Ahaz's predicament, and it's a positive tone up to this point. The two kings he dreads are Syria and Ephraim. They will be destroyed. However, the next verse changes in tone. It states that the terrible time is coming, that one that would rival the time when Ephraim separated from Judah, back in 931 BC. Assyria is coming upon Ahaz and his house, i.e. Judah. Historically, we know that Ahaz called on Assyria for help, but it's uncertain how this passage relates to the timing of his calling for assistance. However, the ominous nature of this sign should have caused Ahaz to abandon any plan of an alliance with Assyria. The 8 verses following describe in considerable detail the destruction of Assyria and even that Assyria and even Egypt would wreak on the land of Israel. It is relatively simple to determine when the parts of this sign were fulfilled, and you probably have a chart in your paper. The first part is verse 7. The land of the two kings Ahaz dreads will be forsaken. By 734 and to 732 was the Syro-Ephraimite war. By the end of that, you could say that the two lands were forsaken. But for sure, by 722, when Samaria is conquered by Assyria, we know for sure that land is now abandoned. So those two parts are for sure done by 722. In verse 17, the king of Assyria will come. Sennacherib came against Jerusalem, and by 701, he had almost destroyed all of Judah except for Jerusalem itself. Historically, by 701 BC, everything described in this sign was fulfilled. The sign makes perfect sense in its historical context. Once Ahaz saw the birth of this child, he would know that God had spared them. The big question is how can this refer to how can Emmanuel refer to Jesus? So question number 2 is, how is Isaiah 7:14 through 17 fulfilled in Christ? The dilemma of this passage is readily apparent. The sign was completely fulfilled in its context. However, Matthew picks it up and says it's fulfilled by Christ. First, it's important to remember this is not a prophecy. It's said to be a sign. So why is a sign fulfilled by Christ? Scholars have offered a variety of explanations to understand how New Testament writers can use Old Testament passages and apply them to a different situation. While there is not room for a full discussion of this issue, we will at least try to give a brief overview. Number one, authors intend one meaning, but it can have many applications or significances. In general, this appears to be the best way to interpret some biblical passages. E.D. Hirsch provided a significant foundation for this principle, and Walter Kaiser is a strong proponent of this view. He states, "No New Testament writer ever finds more or different meaning in an Old Testament text than what was intended by the author." However, like Klein and Blomberg and Hubbard stated earlier, there are times when the New Testament authors found meaning in the Old Testament text that the Old Testament author did not intend. For example, it's hard to see how Hosea 11:1, which says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son," how can that refer to Jesus? Number two, an author intends to convey multiple meanings or levels of meaning. Some scholars have suggested that the author intended a literal sense while at the same time intending a spiritual sense. Even some church fathers, like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, found this use in like an allegory or a parable, or a fable even. However, if biblical texts intend a parable or fable, there are typically hints in the passage suggesting such. Most of these prophecies do not give any such hints. Number three, a later reader invents or reads into a biblical passage a meaning not intended by the author. This idea is commonly suggested by those who hold reader response methods. The main objection, as I see it, to a reader response method to interpret Scripture has to do with the purpose of Scripture. If God desired to give us both revelation about himself and commands he intended us to obey, then there must be specific intent and meaning within the text and not merely words we can interpret as we'd like. Number four, there's a literal sense intended by the human author, but alongside this literal meaning is a hidden meaning embedded by the Holy Spirit that is unknown to the human author. Sometimes they call this sensus plenior, which means fuller sense, which means it has a deeper meaning intended by God, but not intended by the human author. We agree with Kaiser in questioning whether a passage can have multiple meanings. Nevertheless, the New Testament authors sometimes add new, different, or fuller meaning to an Old Testament passage. Number five, a biblical author intended a text to have a single meaning, but later biblical authors can discover an additional meaning in that text. This meaning can be more likely one that the original author did not intend. So something like midrash and pesher are often used to suggest that. Number six, typology. Understanding a person, thing, or event in the Old Testament as prefiguring an event or aspect of Christ in the New Testament. Some scholars use the word typology in a more general sense. Like Dr. Moo from Wheaton, for example, states that it sets it against the background of promise and fulfillment. Therefore, he can see relationships or correspondences between the testaments. Here's what he says. New Testament persons, events, or institutions will sometimes fill up Old Testament persons, events, and institutions by repeating it at a deeper or more climactic level than that which was true in original context. Still, this does not seem to explain what Isaiah 7:14 is doing. Number seven is Richard Bauckham has argued that New Testament authors believe so strongly that Jesus was Lord that he sometimes takes passages from the Old Testament that use the name Lord and apply them to Christ. There is little doubt that New Testament believers read the Old Testament in light of Christ's coming. Even Jesus did so. Luke 4:21, referring to Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. But we believe that the New Testament authors employed a variety of means to apply Old Testament passages to New Testament situations. While certain methods are rarely used, like allegory and pesher, others are significantly more common, like direct fulfillment or general typology, or applying the word Lord passages to Christ. But how does Matthew pick up Isaiah 7:14 and apply it to Christ? We believe the key is to how Matthew reuses Old Testament passages can be found in the text itself. Matthew employs the Greek word plerao, meaning to make full, fill up, or complete, to indicate he believes that the Old Testament passage is being filled up by Jesus. Matthew thus understands the Old Testament passage as a pattern that is being filled up with more meaning. This is not to say that the Old Testament passages were prophesying Jesus, since they can be completely understood within the Old Testament context. However, Matthew takes the pattern presented in those Old Testament passages and applies them to a new situation. It's analogous to a coffee cup having meaning poured into it. Thus, it's distinctly different from sensus plenior. For there's no hidden meaning in the Old Testament that the New Testament author has discovered through divine inspiration. Rather, the meaning was not in the Old Testament context. The concept here is distinct from typology in that it's not simply a general structure that the New Testament author picked up from the Old Testament and applied to a New Testament concept. Rather, the New Testament author informed the reader of his intentions by using the word plerao before adding the new meaning to the Old Testament context. However, these patterns cannot be added to indefinitely, for just like a coffee cup, at some point it gets filled to the brim and no more can be added and just pours out after that. So it is with a pattern that a New Testament author chooses to fill up. At some point, it will hold no more meaning. For example, in Matthew 1:21 through 23, Jesus is said to fill up, a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. There is no more that can be added to God with us than Jesus. He is God incarnate. However, there are two important notes about Matthew 1:23. Number one, it's a modified form of the Septuagint in that it uses the word parthenos, but it says, they, not she, will call his name Emmanuel, as found in the Septuagint. The author thus modifies or adapts the Old Testament or the Septuagint passage. Number two, there's a development of the Greek word parthenos. You've got a chart there, hopefully soon. The Greek word parthenos appears to have developed in meaning over centuries. In early Greek literature, it appears to have the meaning of a young woman of marriageable age, with or without the focus on virginity. But by New Testament times, this word developed a more technical meaning of virgin. For a good example of this meaning of parthenos in the Septuagint, see Genesis 34:3, where Dinah is called a parthenos even after she's been raped by Shechem. This development of meaning is quite similar to our English word, to cleave. For the King James English, it meant to stick together. Remember Genesis 2:24, where it says, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife? So there it means to stick. But speakers today are more familiar with the idea of a meat cleaver, which splits meat apart. That's a 180-degree change in meaning. Because the English language is a living language, it can evolve in meaning, similar to Greek. If this development is true, then the sign in Isaiah 7:14 of a young woman, Alma, having a child would have been a common natural occurrence. However, the part that would have convinced Ahaz that God could be trusted was that the child would be a boy and his mother would call the boy's name Emmanuel. The translator of the Septuagint about 250 to 150 BC chose the Greek word parthenos to translate the Hebrew word alma. This would have been an excellent choice to convey what the Septuagint author meant. However, in the intervening years between the Septuagint and the New Testament book of Matthew, the word parthenos changed in meaning from young woman to virgin, thus making it a suitable term to describe Mary in the New Testament 1st century AD. To be convincing here, I need to have more examples were Matthew's use of plerao to fill up an Old Testament pattern. So we argue that Jesus coming out of Egypt in Matthew 2:15, when it says he pleraos it, he fills it up, Hosea 11:1, which in its original context describes the past event of God bringing his people out of Egypt in the Exodus. Another example is Matthew 2:17 and 18, where the events surrounding the Babylonian exile are filled up, plerao, by Herod killing the babies in Bethlehem. In Matthew 23, Jesus is said to fill up, plerao, the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene. This passage appears to be a play on words of Isaiah 11:1, where the branch, Nezer, sounds a lot like Nazarene. So I think it's a play on the words there. There are also places in Matthew where the Old Testament passage is used without the preceding word plerao, to fill up. For example, Matthew 2:5 and 6 quotes Micah 5:2 and introduces it with, "For it is written by the prophet," to signify this is a direct fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy, as distinct from a filling up of a prophecy. As noted above, Old Testament authors can use a variety of ways for New Testament authors to use Old Testament passages. We believe that the New Testament authors filling up Old Testament passages is one more way New Testament authors can use Old Testament passages to apply to a new situation or a person in the New Testament. Number 3, is there more than one virgin birth in the Bible? I think now you know the answer. The short answer to this question is no. Actually, the long answer to this question is no too, but all right. All right. In Isaiah 7:14, Alma is a young woman who gives birth to a son. It's interesting that almost all the new modern translations will translate Alma as young woman everywhere, but in this verse. I even know a story about the NIV committee. A guy named Louis Goldberg was one of the original translators. He said they spent over a month trying to decide how to translate this because they knew that Alma meant young woman, but they knew what had happened to the RSV back in 1951 when they tried translating it as young woman. It got it got labeled as a liberal translation. And they didn't want that. It doesn't matter how good your translation is if no one reads it. Yeah. All right. The child named Emmanuel appears to have been born during Isaiah's lifetime. For in Isaiah 8:8, it says that Assyria would overflow into Judah and fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Thus, Emmanuel must have been living in the land of Judah at the time of the 8th century when Sennacherib attacked Judah. However, Isaiah 14 is used in Matthew 1:21 through 23 to refer to Mary, who is indeed a virgin. See the statements in the gospel that demand such. Like Matthew 1:18, it says before they came together, Joseph he found her to be with child, so he was going to divorce her. And then in Luke 1:27, it calls her a virgin, pledged to be married. And then in Luke 1:23, after an angel's announcement, Mary says, "How can this be, for I'm a virgin?" Mary's birth of Jesus in the New Testament is the only virgin birth in the Bible. Conclusion. We know that the New Testament authors use Old Testament passages in a variety of ways. The New Testament reuse of Isaiah 7:14 is complicated by 2 issues. One, the issue of plerao, or filling up with meaning. And 2, the usage of the change of the meaning for parthenos from emphasis on a young woman to the more technical sense of virgin. To understand how New Testament authors used Old Testament passages demands a thorough investigation of the evidence to determine what the authors did indeed intend. This process deepens our respect and appreciation for divine revelation and how God guided the overarching plan and the message of Scripture. The amazing story of God coming to the earth through a birth of a son to a virgin once again reminds us that God does things we might never comprehend unless he revealed them to us.